Every day, people are being accused of being on the payroll of the Russians. We had George Galloway on the show after he was labelled, quote, Russia state-affiliated media by Twitter. Yeah, look at that. Russia state-affiliated media, George Galloway. It's still up there. But take a look at this guy. This is Jim Spellman. He's an ex-CNN guy who works for CGTN. That stands for China Global Television Network, which actually is Chinese state-affiliated media. Actually, it's controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And yet Jim Spellman, if you notice, he's completely unlabeled by Twitter. Russia can reduce certain coastal cities in Ukraine to rubble, which is tough if you happen to live there. But China wages war in subtler ways, and its tentacles reach into every corner of our lives. Natalie Winters of the National Pulse has written about this. We're always glad to see Natalie. There's a kind of express checkout from CNN that leads you straight to a cushy job with these Chinese guys, Natalie.
Well, the fact that there is a revolving door between CNN and CGTN, the premier Chinese state-run media outlet, tells you all you need to know about the editorial line of CNN. But it's not even just a problem housed at CNN, and the same goes for the New York Times and even the BBC. We also put up a story at the National Pulse tracking several former high-level BBC staffers who ended up working for China Global Television Network as well. But I think it really, really makes you wonder why the Chinese Communist Party's premier state-run outlet, again, the same outlet that pushes propaganda every single day, every word that comes out of those hosts' mouth is basically approved by Beijing. So they're not going to let any loose cannons in there. So it really makes you wonder why they would feel so comfortable hiring people from CNN, from the West, from the BBC. And it's because they know that they're not going to criticize the Chinese Communist Party. Because the evidence is the work that they've done for their former outlets. I'd even add one more name in there, an individual by the name of Jonah Kessel, who used to actually be, or is currently serving as the director of cinematography over at the New York Times. But he actually used to work for China Daily. He did their entire website redesign back in 2010. He actually used to tweet about how much he loved working for the Chinese Communist Party until we exposed his tweets. He ended up deleting all them. But there really is a concerning relationship between a lot of Western media outlets and their Chinese Communist Party counterparts.
The Chinese have done this on the sly, but you look at, say, the way stories that should get more traction but don't. For example, the protests in Hong Kong a year or two back, where at one point a third of the population of Hong Kong, over 2 million people, were on the streets, which is pretty spectacular. And yet if you switched on an American news broadcast or you looked at the New York Times or even the BBC, as you say, they didn't seem that interested in it. Do you think, in other words, everybody is adjusting consciously or unconsciously to the power realities here?
Oh, it's definitely the case. And on the Chinese Communist Party side, this is a very calculated and orchestrated effort. This is political warfare at its finest. They know that most Americans, most people in the West, unfortunately watch these outlets, although maybe not CNN Plus anymore, but watch CNN, watch, MSNBC, and take what they say as gold, right? It's high church for a lot of people and a lot of important, influential people in Washington, D.C. who make decisions. But what they don't know is that a lot of the factors that are influencing the editorial lines at these outlets, whether it be the fact that China Daily is paying for advertisements in a lot of these papers and for a lot of these TV networks, or even that a lot of these kind of Chinese foreign influence groups, those that have been flagged by various branches of the federal government as seeking explicitly to try to get Americans on the payroll of the Chinese Communist Party so they will do their bidding for them in the mainstream media. You can see these journalists taking trips to China in exchange for favorable coverage when they return. And I think that's why you don't see a lot of coverage on what's going on in Shanghai right now. And there's a lot of ramifications when that happens, because think about it. The Chinese Communist Party got away with what they did in Hong Kong because the media didn't hold them to account. Obviously, Chinese state-run media is not going to do it. So Western media has a unique responsibility in that situation. But because they didn't do anything, the Chinese Communist Party got off scot-free. And I think that's part of the reason that you see such an emboldened China today.
It's also true, isn't it, that they got off scot-free pretty much with what was going on in Wuhan, where basically, well, for example, at Wuhan, they closed the Wuhan airport to domestic flights elsewhere in China, so you couldn't fly from Wuhan to Shanghai. But on the other hand, you could fly from Wuhan to Milan or New York or Vancouver or Berlin. And it's very strange to me that there was so little interest in that in major Western news outlets such as CNN or the New York Times. It's almost as if their priority was to create some kind of narrative that didn't disturb anybody on the Chinese Politburo.
Well, just like I think most products in the West, you know, they're made in China, I think a lot of the times the same goes for the talking points that you hear coming out of these Western media outlets. It seems that the only people that they're okay criticizing, at least in the early days of COVID-19, were people who were willing to say China virus. All you kind of saw was ad hominem attacks on people who said that as being racist. Yet in reality, they were doing softball interviews with a lot of Chinese Communist Party leaders, even people who worked at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And remember, the fact checkers who, you know, silenced, I'm sure, a lot of people watching this show, the individuals that they were citing, that they were hailing as credible authorities and voices on the issue were researchers from the Wuhan Institute of Virology themselves. So it's really mind-boggling, and I think it shows you where their allegiances lie. It's not with the truth; it's with the Chinese Communist Party.
And added to that, we should say, is a lot of these so-called news outlets are part of big multinational entertainment conglomerates for whom making sure that Fast and Furious 37 is allowed to open in all those Chinese multiplexes is as important as any real news consideration. Thank you very much for that, Natalie. It's a fascinating piece, and I was interested to see you can't get anyone from CNN to comment on that. Oh, and if you didn't, if you're a British subject and you had no idea what Natalie was on about when she referred to CNN Plus, that's a new CNN service they launched a month ago, and it was such a disaster they canned it after a month. So people expecting GBNews to close every hour of the day. We're still here, coming up to our first year. CNN Plus lasted a month. Thank you, Natalie.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.